Okay, so we're just going to go through, and this is a review over everything because you do have your test tomorrow. So the first thing we're going to look at is it says the range of the data for Mrs. Agnew's third period class is less than the range of the data for her fourth period class. So the first thing we're going to remember is what is range. So what is range? Range is your maximum minus your minimum. So looking at these, how do you find the range for her third period? You'd subtract this side from this side. So for her third period, the range would be 28 because it drops down right there, minus 0 because it drops down right there. Then how would you find the range for her fourth period? For her fourth period, you'd just still do the maximum minus the minimum, which would be 30 minus 5. And that gives us 25. So is it true that the range for the third period class is less than the range for the fourth period class? No, this is false. The next one says the median number of minutes studied is greater for Mrs. Agnew's class than a fourth period than the median for the third period. So how do you find median on a box plot? Your median is the line that is inside of your box. So this is the median for the third period class, and that is 15. And then the median for the fourth period class drops down right here, and that is 20. So is it true that the median number of minutes studied for the fourth period class is greater than the third period class? Yes, this statement right here is true. Right, this one says the dot plots show the number of goals scored by two soccer teams during a 15-game session. Use the information to determine if the statements are true or false. So this one says the mode number of goals scored by the Lions is less than the mode number of goals scored by the Tigers. So remember, what is another word for mode? Most. So looking at the Lions, which is right here, what is their mode? Their mode is 2 because it has the most dots. And then looking at the Tigers, what is their mode? Their mode is 5 because it has the most dots. So is it true that the mode number of goals scored by the Lions is less than the number of mode scores by the Tigers? Yes, that is true because Lions is less than Tigers. This one says the median number of goals scored by the Tigers is equal to the median number of goals scored by the Lions. And what's another name for median? Middle. And how do we find the middle of a dot plot? This is where you go through and you cross off the smallest dot and then the biggest dot and the smallest dot and then the biggest dot. So let's go through and do that. Oops, there. And then you are just left with a bunch of 2s. So the median for the Lions is what? 2. Okay, so I want you to do the same thing that we just did for the Tigers. So you should have done lowest, biggest, lowest, biggest, lowest, biggest, lowest, biggest, lowest, biggest, lowest, biggest, and you're left with a bunch of 5s. So the Tigers' median is 5. So is it true that the medians are equal to each other? No, this statement is false. Okay, and then this one says the bar graph shows the number of each item sold at 2 locations of a bakery. Now remember, the first thing we do is we just go through and we figure out how many each bar is worth. So if we look right here at Cake Pops is worth 40. And then Cake Pops for store 1 is going to be worth 30. The black bar is store 2 and the gray bar is store 1. And then how many brownies are there for store 2? That's right here, which is like this halfway mark. So that right there is halfway between 30 and 40. So that makes that 35. Then brownies for store 1 is right there at that half mark between 20 and 30. So that makes that 25. And then how many cupcakes are there for store 2? That would be 30. And then how many cupcakes are there for store 1? That would be 60. How many cookies are there for store 2? Well, if we take this and we drag it down, it's right there at that halfway mark between 10 and 20, which means that is 15. And then if we take this and drag it down, that is that halfway mark between 20 and 30, which makes that 25. So it says which item accounted for 1/3 of the sales at store 2. So I need to go ahead and I need to add up everything that was sold at store 2. That's my first step. So remember, store 2 is the black, and what is your total for store 2? If you add all of that together, all of the black bars together, you would have added 40 plus 35 plus 30 plus 15, and you would have found that the total is 120. Now remember, all fractions are just part over wholes. We're not setting up a percent because it doesn't ask for a percent, but all fractions are just part over wholes. So this on the bottom would be our whole, which is 120. Now, I need to know what accounts for 1/3 of the total sales. Now, I could go through and I could try each number. So I could try 40 and see if that simplifies to 1/3. I could try 35 and see if that simplifies to 1/3. I could try for 30 and see if that simplifies to 1/3. Or we could set up a proportion. I know that I want whatever my part is to equal 1/3 of the sales. So how do you solve a proportion? Cross multiply, so we have 120 times 1, which gives us 120. And then I have 3 times x, which gives us 3x. And then I divide both sides by 3, and that gives me x equals 40. So if we look up here, what item is 40? That would be Cake Pops. The other way that you could have done it is you could have gone through and you could have said, okay, so I'm going to try 40 over 120, and I'm going to see that those are both divisible by 10, probably to start with, and that would give us 4 over 12. And then those are both divisible by 4, and so that would give me 1/3. And so I would see that the Cake Pops account for 1/3 of the sales. All right, and then it says cupcakes make up approximately what percent of sales at store 1? So remember, store 1 is the gray. So how do we find a percent? We set up a proportion. In this case, nothing changed, so we're using part over whole equals percent over 100. Now, it's asking about cupcakes from store 1. That is 60. So where is that going to go? That's going to go in my part because that's not everything that was sold. And then it's just talking about store 1. So how would I find my whole for store 1? You would go through and you would add all of store 1's values up together to find that whole. So I would do 30 plus 25 plus 60 plus 25. And that gives us 140 as a whole. And then it's asking about the percent, so we don't know what the percent is. So we have 60 over 140 equals x over 100. And I solve by cross multiplying, so I have 60 times 100 to start with. I start with the 6 times 1, which gives me 6. And then I just tack on my 1, 2, 3 zeros. Equals 140 times x, which gives us 140x. I divide both sides by 140, and those cross out. And I have 14 going into 60. 14 would go into 60. Let's see, we have 14 times 1, which gives us 14, times 2, which would give us 28. We'll add another 14 to see what times 3 would be. Add another 14 to see what times 4 would be. And it's really close to 60 right there with the times 4, so it's going to go in 4 times. 4 times 14 gives me 56. Subtracting that gives me 4. I have to add a decimal and a 0 and drop that down. And then how many times does 14 go into 40? Well, if we look here, 42 is too big. So I'm going to go back to here, and it would go in 2 times. 2 times 14 is 28. Subtract, and that gives me 12. Add another 0 and drop it down. And then we're just going to cut it off there, and we're going to round this to 4.3. I just realized this was supposed to be 6,000. So this is going to move over to here. It would be these 2 zeros that would cross off. And so that's going to be 42%. Sorry about the confusion. Okay. Because that decimal would go up there. All right. Then we're going to take a look at this. So the circle graph shows the eye colors of students at Hillside Middle School. The first thing I notice is that this green is missing. So what would I do to solve for the green? Well, I know that all circle graphs add to equal 100%. So I would solve green by doing what? I would start by adding everything that I know to figure out what I would need to add to get to 100. So I would do 12 plus 8 plus 72. And 2 plus 8 is 10, plus 2 is 12, so write down a 2, carry my 1. 1 plus 1 is 2, plus 7 is 9. Now, all circle graphs add to equal 100%. So I know that what I know plus my green has to equal 100%. So what would that be right there for the green? That would be 8. Okay, so this one says, if there are 725 students at Hillside Middle School, how many more students have brown eyes than green eyes? So the first thing I have to do is I have to figure out how many kids have brown eyes. What I know is I know that there are 72% of kids that have brown eyes. So what would I do to figure out how many kids have brown eyes? I would set up a proportion. So I have part over whole equals percent over 100. I know that 72% of kids have brown eyes. So that goes right there in my percent. And I know that there are a total of 725 kids. So I have x over 725 equals 72 over 100. Cross multiply, we have 725 times 72. And that gives us 52,200. I'm going to take out that comma. And then we have x times 100, which gives us 100x. Divide by sides by 100. Cross off those 2 zeros, and you would find that it's 522 students that have brown eyes. But the question is, how many more students have brown eyes than green eyes? So now we have to figure out how many students have green eyes. So how would you do that? Well, I see that it's 8% of kids that have green eyes. So I have part over whole equals percent over 100. And my percent is the 8. And my whole is that there are still 725 students at this school. And then x is still my part. So I have x over 725 equals 8 over 100. We solve this by cross multiplying. So I have 725 times 8, which gives me 5,800 equals 100x. Divide both sides by 100, and that gives us 58. Now the question still is how many more students have brown eyes than green eyes? So how do you figure that out? How many more means that you subtract. So we do 522 minus 58. This 2 turns into a 12. This 2 turns into a 1. 12 minus 8 gives me 4. This 1 right here has to turn into an 11. So this 5 right here turns into a 4. 11 minus 5 is 6. And that gives me 464 as my final answer.